Hey guys, let me tell you something that might completely change the way you think about one of the most romanticized periods in Chinese history. When most people hear Three Kingdoms, they immediately think of legendary warriors like Guan Yu swinging his green dragon crescent blade, or the cunning strategist Zhuge Liang outwitting his enemies with seemingly supernatural foresight, or the burning ships at the Battle of Red Cliffs lighting up the Yangtze River in a hellscape of fire and chaos. And look, all of that is incredible and dramatic and makes for amazing stories that have been told for nearly 2,000 years. But what if I told you that buried underneath all those tales of heroism and betrayal and massive pitched battles, there was a quieter revolution happening, a revolution that didn't involve swords or siege towers or dramatic last stands, but rather involved things like better plows, improved steel-making techniques, medical breakthroughs, and mechanical devices that would have seemed like pure magic to the common people of the era. This is the boring story of the Three Kingdoms, boring, of course, being entirely relative, because once you start digging into what was actually happening on the technological and scientific front during this period, you realize it was anything but boring. It was, in fact, one of the most innovative periods in Chinese history. Precisely because the chaos and competition of the era demanded innovation, three rival states, each desperate for any advantage over the others, each pouring resources into anything that might give them an edge. And that edge didn't always come from having more soldiers or braver generals. Sometimes it came from having a better way to irrigate your fields, or a more efficient method for transporting grain to your armies, or a medical tradition that kept your troops healthier and fighting longer than the enemy. So let me set the stage for you. The Three Kingdoms period is generally considered to span from 220 to 280 C, though the chaos that gave rise to it started decades earlier during the decline of the Eastern Han Dynasty. By the time the dust had settled from the Yellow Turban Rebellion, the warlord conflicts, and the eventual collapse of centralized Han authority, China had fractured into three competing states. In the north you had Wei, founded by Cao Pi, but built on the military and political foundation laid by his father. The legendary Cao Cao. In the southwest you had Shu Han, ruled by Liu Bei and later his son Liu Shan, with the ever-famous Zhuge Liang serving as chancellor and chief strategist. And in the southeast you had Wu, controlled by the Sun family, first Sun Quan and then his successors, commanding the rich lands south of the Yangtze. Now, here's the thing about having three states locked in a prolonged standoff. None of them could afford to sit still. Wei had the largest population and the most arable land, which gave it a natural advantage in terms of raw resources and manpower. Shuhan was tucked away in the mountainous terrain of modern-day Sichuan, which made it incredibly defensible but also limited its agricultural output and population base. Wu controlled the waterways and the fertile lands of the Yangtze River Delta, giving it tremendous naval power and economic potential but leaving it vulnerable to the sheer numerical superiority of Wei. Each state had to maximize what it had, and that meant innovation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. Let us start with agriculture, because at the end of the day, everything in the ancient world came back to food. You could have the most brilliant generals and the bravest soldiers in the world, but if you couldn't feed them, none of it mattered. And feeding massive armies while also maintaining a functioning civilian population was one of the central challenges of the Three Kingdoms era. Cao Cao, even before Wei was formally established as a kingdom, understood this fundamental reality better than perhaps anyone else of his time. One of his most significant policies was the establishment of military agricultural colonies, known as tunshan. The concept wasn't entirely new, there were precedents in earlier Chinese history, but Cao Cao implemented it on a scale and with a systematic rigor that was genuinely revolutionary. The idea was straightforward. Soldiers, when not actively campaigning, would farm designated lands. Refugees and displaced civilians were also settled on state-owned land and required to farm it, with a portion of their harvest going to the state. This created a self-sustaining system where military readiness and food production were directly linked. But the Tunshan system wasn't just about putting people on land and telling them to grow things. It also drove agricultural technology forward because the state had a direct interest in maximizing yields. If you could get more grain per unit of land, you could support more soldiers, which meant more military power. Simple math, enormous consequences. Under this system, there were improvements in irrigation techniques, crop rotation practices, and the development and wider distribution of more efficient farming tools. One of the key agricultural technologies that saw significant development and spread during this period was the chain pump, a device used for irrigation. Now, chain pumps in some basic form may have existed before the Three Kingdoms, but it was during this era that they became more widely used and more mechanically sophisticated. The device consisted of a series of wooden planks or pallets attached to a continuous chain that looped around two wheels. When operated usually by foot pedals, though sometimes by hand cranks or even water power, the planks would move through a wooden trough, carrying water upward from a lower source to a higher field. It was elegant in its simplicity and remarkably effective. A single chain pump operated by one or two people could irrigate fields that would otherwise require dozens of workers carrying water in buckets. This was a massive force multiplier for agricultural productivity, and in an era when every spare labor could potentially be a soldier instead, it mattered enormously. The state of Wei, with its vast northern plains and its desperate need to feed both its enormous army and its civilian population, was particularly aggressive in promoting irrigation technology. But Wei wasn't alone. Over in Shuhan, the situation was different but no less pressing. Sichuan, the heartland of Shu, was actually blessed with fertile soil and a relatively mild climate, but it was surrounded by mountains and had a limited amount of flat, arable land compared to the northern plains. The ancient Zhuge Liang irrigation system, built centuries earlier during the Qin era, was still functioning and remained the backbone of Shu's agricultural productivity. But maintaining and improving this system, along with developing additional irrigation infrastructure, was a constant priority. Every grain of rice and every bushel of wheat mattered when you were a smaller state trying to project military power beyond your mountain borders. And this brings us to one of the most famous figures associated with technological innovation in the Three Kingdoms, Zhuge Liang. Now, I know I said this was supposed to be the boring story, and bringing up Zhuge Liang might seem like I am veering back into the dramatic and legendary territory. But bear with me, because the technological contributions attributed to Zhuge Liang, while certainly embellished by centuries of storytelling, point to real innovations that were critically important. The most famous of these is the wooden ox and gliding horse, or Mu Ni Alumai in Chinese. According to historical sources, including the records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shou, which is considered the most reliable historical text for this period, Zhuge Liang developed these devices to solve one of Shuhan's most persistent and crippling problems. Logistics, specifically, the problem of transporting supplies through the incredibly difficult mountainous terrain between Shu's base in Sichuan and the front lines of its northern military campaigns. Think about this for a moment. Zhuge Liang's northern expeditions, his repeated attempts to attack Wei and reclaim the old Han capital, required moving enormous quantities of grain, weapons, and equipment through some of the most rugged mountain passes in all of China. The roads, such as they were, wound through narrow valleys, climbed steep ridges, and crossed rushing rivers. Traditional ox carts were slow and cumbersome on these paths. Pack animals could only carry so much. Human porters were expensive in terms of both the labor they represented and the food they themselves consumed during the long journeys. The logistics problem was, in many ways, the single greatest obstacle to Shuhan's military ambitions. The wooden ox and gliding horse were Zhuge Liang's answer to this problem. Now, what exactly these devices were has been a matter of debate among historians and engineers for centuries. The historical texts provide some descriptions, but they are maddeningly vague and sometimes contradictory. Some scholars believe they were simply improved wheelbarrow designs, single-wheeled carts that could be pushed by one person along narrow mountain paths where wider vehicles couldn't pass. Others have proposed more elaborate mechanical explanations, suggesting they may have involved gear mechanisms or lever systems that made it easier to transport heavy loads uphill. Some modern engineers have even attempted to reconstruct them based on the available descriptions, with varying results. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that whatever the wooden ox and gliding horse actually were, they represented a genuine improvement in transport technology that addressed a real and pressing military need. The fact that they were recorded in a relatively sober historical source, like the records of the Three Kingdoms, rather than only appearing in the more fanciful romance of the Three Kingdoms, written over 1,000 years later, gives the claim some credibility, and the broader point is important. Shuhan, the smallest and most resource-constrained of the Three Kingdoms, had to be the most creative in solving its logistical problems, and that pressure produced real technological innovation. But let's move beyond agriculture and logistics to talk about something that might seem even less glamorous, but was absolutely foundational to everything else. Metallurgy. The Three Kingdoms period saw significant advances in iron and steel production, and these advances had cascading effects on military equipment, agricultural tools, and everyday life. China had been producing cast iron since at least the 5th century BC, centuries before Europe achieved the same capability. By the Han Dynasty, Chinese metallurgists had developed sophisticated techniques for producing steel by carefully controlling the carbon content of iron. But the Three Kingdoms era pushed these techniques further, driven once again by the relentless demands of military competition. One of the key developments was the wider adoption and refinement of co-fusion steel making, a technique where wrought iron and cast iron were melted together to produce steel with a carbon content somewhere between the two. This method, sometimes called the 100 refinings technique, produced weapons and armor of remarkably high quality. The phrase 100 refinings wasn't just poetic, it referred to the repeated folding and hammering of the metal, which helped distribute the carbon more evenly and remove impurities, resulting in blades that were harder, sharper, and more durable than what could be achieved with simpler techniques. The state of Wei, with its control over the traditional iron-producing regions of northern China, had a natural advantage in metallurgy. But all Three Kingdoms invested heavily in weapons production, and the competition drove improvements across the board. Swords, spear points, arrowheads, and armor plates all benefited from these advances. And it wasn't just military equipment. Better iron and steel meant better agricultural tools, which circled back to the food production issue I mentioned earlier. A stronger plow blade that held its edge longer meant more efficient farming, which meant more food, which meant more people could be supported, including more soldiers. The interconnections were everywhere. There's also the matter of crossbow technology, which deserves special mention. The crossbow had been a staple of Chinese military technology for centuries before the Three Kingdoms, but this period saw important refinements. The repeating crossbow, sometimes called the Zhuge crossbow, named after Zhuge Liang again, though it almost certainly predated him in some form, was a device that could fire multiple bolts in rapid succession using a simple lever mechanism. A wooden magazine mounted on top of the crossbow held a stack of bolts, and each push and pull of the lever would simultaneously draw the bowstring, drop a bolt into the firing position, and release it. A trained operator could fire multiple bolts in the time it took a conventional crossbow user to fire one. Now the repeating crossbow had trade-offs. The bolts were generally lighter and had less penetrating power than those fired from a standard military crossbow. Its range was shorter. Against heavily armored opponents, it was less effective. But against massed infantry or in defensive situations where volume of fire mattered more than individual accuracy and penetration, it could be devastating. and the fact that it required relatively little training to operate compared to the years of practice needed to master a powerful conventional bow made it an excellent weapon for militia forces and garrison troops. Whether Zhuge Liang actually invented an improved version of the repeating crossbow or whether his name was simply attached to it by later tradition is unclear. But the technology itself was real, it was used during this period, and it represented an important principle that would resonate throughout military history. Sometimes quantity of fire matters more than quality of individual shots. Let me also touch briefly on something that might seem completely unrelated to warfare, but was actually deeply connected to it. Paper making. Paper had been invented during the Han Dynasty, with Kai Lun traditionally credited for significantly improving the process around 105 C. Over a century before the Three Kingdoms period began, but it was during the subsequent decades, including the Three Kingdoms era, that paper gradually began to replace bamboo strips and silk as the primary medium for writing. Why does this matter for our story about technology and innovation? Because bureaucracy matters. Running a state, managing tax records, communicating orders to distant military commanders, maintaining census data, recording legal codes requires enormous amounts of written documentation. On bamboo strips, which were the traditional writing medium, this documentation was heavy, bulky, and difficult to transport. Silk was lighter but expensive. Paper was lighter than bamboo, cheaper than silk, and could be produced in large quantities from readily available materials like hemp, bark, and old rags. As paper became more widely available and more commonly used during this period, it facilitated more efficient administration. Orders could be transmitted more easily. Records could be kept more systematically. Knowledge could be shared more broadly. This might not sound exciting, and it certainly doesn't compare to the drama of Red Cliffs or the tragedy of Guan Yu's Last Stand, but it was a quiet revolution in information technology that made the complex administrative machinery of these competing states more functional and effective. And that, fundamentally, is the theme of this entire story. The Three Kingdoms period is remembered for its heroes and villains, its epic battles and cunning stratagems. But underneath all of that, there was a relentless, unglamorous, absolutely critical process of technological development happening. Farmers were getting better tools. Engineers were building better irrigation systems. Metallurgists were producing better steel. Logisticians were figuring out how to move supplies through impossible terrain. Bureaucrats were writing on paper instead of bamboo. None of these things make for great opera or blockbuster movies, but they were the foundation upon which everything else rested. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the medical advances of the period, including the legendary and possibly apocryphal surgical feats attributed to the physician Ho-Tu, and we'll explore the mechanical engineering achievements that went beyond just agricultural tools and transportation devices. We'll look at how the competition between Wei Shu and Wu drove innovation in shipbuilding, fortification design, and the development of new military tactics that were as much about engineering as they were about strategy. The boring story continues and only gets more fascinating from here. The boring story of China. The Three Kingdoms Technology and Discoveries, Part 2, The Doctor, the Shipwright, and the Fortress Builder. Let us begin with a man who may or may not have offered to saw open the skull of the most powerful warlord in China. Ho-Tu is one of those historical figures who sits uncomfortably at the intersection of documented fact and accumulated legend, and the Three Kingdoms period is precisely the kind of era that makes separating the two an exercise in perpetual frustration. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that a physician named Ho-Tu existed, that he practiced medicine during the late Eastern Han and into the early Three Kingdoms period, that he was renowned enough to be summoned by Cao Cao himself, and that things did not end well for him. The details beyond that become progressively murkier the more closely you examine them. The historical records, primarily the Sangguoji compiled by Chen Xiao and the Hao Hanshu compiled by Fan Yi, credit Ho-Tu with remarkable surgical capabilities. He is said to have used a preparation called mafesin, which translates roughly to cannabis boiling powder, as a general anesthetic. The exact composition of this preparation is unknown because, according to tradition, Ho Tu's medical texts were destroyed, either burned by the man himself before his execution or burned by his jailer's wife when the jailer tried to preserve them. This is the kind of conveniently tragic detail that historians have learned to regard with a raised eyebrow. But it is also not implausible the destruction of texts, both deliberate and accidental, was so common in periods of political upheaval that the survival of any document from the Three Kingdoms period is more surprising than its loss. What matters for our purposes is not whether Ho Tu actually proposed trepanning Kaka's skull to cure his chronic headaches, a suggestion that, if it was actually made, showed either extraordinary medical confidence or an extraordinary lack of political awareness, but rather what the medical practices attributed to him tell us about the state of medical knowledge during the period. Chinese medicine by the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries had already developed a sophisticated theoretical framework based on the concepts of qi, yin and yang, and the 5 phases. The foundational texts, the Huangdi Neijing and the Nanjing, were already in circulation, and the Shangyan Zabing Lun, attributed to Zhang Zhongjing, a contemporary of Ho Tu, represented a major advancement in diagnostic methodology and herbal pharmacology. Zhang Zhongjing is, in many ways, more important to the actual history of Chinese medicine than Ho Tu, but he is far less famous because he did not have the good fortune to be written into the romance of the Three Kingdoms as a dramatic character. He simply wrote a comprehensive medical text that would be used, refined, and referenced for the next 1800 years. This is, by any reasonable measure, a far more consequential achievement than any single surgery, but it is also exactly the kind of achievement that gets overlooked because it is fundamentally boring. A man sits down, synthesizes his clinical experience and inherited knowledge, and writes a book. There is no dramatic tension in that. There is no villain. There is no skull to be sawed open. Zhang Zhongjing's Shangyan Zabing Lun, the treatise on cold damage and miscellaneous diseases, was notable for its systematic approach to diagnosis and treatment. It organized diseases by their progression through the body, described symptoms at each stage, and prescribed specific herbal formulations for each combination of symptoms. This was not mere cataloging. It was an attempt to create a rational, reproducible system of medicine that any trained physician could apply. Many of the herbal formulations described in the text are still used in traditional Chinese medicine today, some of them with compositions that have remained essentially unchanged for nearly 2 millennia. The text was later split into 2 separate works, the Shangyan Lun dealing with febrile diseases and the Jingui Yaolu dealing with miscellaneous internal diseases, and both became core texts in the Chinese medical canon. The context for these medical developments was grim. The late Eastern Han Dynasty was ravaged by a series of devastating epidemics, the most severe of which struck between roughly 171 and 185 C and continued in waves into the Three Kingdoms period. These plagues killed an estimated proportion of the population that, while impossible to quantify precisely, was clearly enormous. Zhang Zhongjing himself wrote in his preface that 2/3 of his own clan of over 200 people had died within a decade, with 7/10 of those deaths caused by infectious disease. This was not abstract medical theorizing. This was a physician watching his family die around him and trying, with increasing desperation, to understand why and to find treatments that worked. The military dimension of medicine during the Three Kingdoms cannot be overlooked either. Armies were breeding grounds for disease, and the generals who could keep their soldiers alive and functional had a significant strategic advantage. Camp hygiene, wound treatment, and the management of epidemic disease were practical military concerns that drove investment in medical knowledge. The records suggest that all Three Kingdoms maintained military physicians, and that the treatment of battle wounds, including the extraction of arrowheads, the setting of broken bones, and the treatment of infected wounds, had reached a level of practical competence that, While rudimentary by modern standards, was sophisticated for its time. Now let us turn to water, because the Three Kingdoms period was, to a degree that is often underappreciated, a naval era. The geography of the conflict made this inevitable. The Yangtze River, one of the longest rivers in the world, served as the primary strategic boundary between the northern state of Wei and the southern states of Wu and Shu. Control of the Yangtze and its tributaries was not merely advantageous, it was existential. For Sun Quan's kingdom of Wu, especially, naval power was the foundation of survival. Wu controlled the lower Yangtze and the coastal regions of southeastern China, and its ability to project power along the river and defend against northern incursions depended entirely on the quality and quantity of its ships. The shipbuilding capabilities of Wu during this period were remarkable. The historical records describe a variety of vessel types, including large warships called tower ships Laochuan that were multi-decked vessels capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers. These were not simple rafts or barges. They were engineered watercraft with multiple levels, defensive barriers, and accommodation for both combat troops and the sailors who operated them. The largest of these vessels reportedly had 5 decks and could carry approximately 3,000 men. Though such figures from ancient sources should be treated with appropriate caution, even if we discount the numbers substantially, the engineering required to build stable, multi-decked river warships of any significant size was considerable. Wu also developed specialized vessel types for different tactical purposes. There were fast attack boats Mengchong, or covered assault ships that were armored with leather hides to protect against arrows and fire, and that could be used to ram enemy vessels or to close rapidly for boarding actions. There were supply barges, troop transports, and reconnaissance vessels. The diversity of ship types implies a level of naval strategic thinking that went well beyond simply putting soldiers on boats. These were purpose-built tools designed for specific tactical roles within a coherent naval doctrine. The Battle of Red Cliffs in Tuho-8C, regardless of how much of the traditional account is historically accurate, demonstrated the strategic importance of naval capability. Koka's Northern Army, for all its numerical superiority, was defeated in significant part because it could not match the riverine expertise of the combined Wushu forces. The northern soldiers were reportedly unfamiliar with waterborne warfare and suffered from seasickness, a detail that, while seemingly trivial, had genuine tactical implications. Soldiers who are vomiting cannot fight effectively. Sailors who have grown up on the waterways of the Yangtze had an enormous experiential advantage that no amount of numerical superiority could easily overcome. The shipbuilding innovations of Wu extended beyond military applications. The kingdom's economic prosperity depended on waterborne trade, and the construction of merchant vessels, fishing boats, and transport ships was a constant activity. Wu also mounted maritime expeditions along the Chinese coast and, according to the historical records, sent a major naval expedition to Taiwan, then called Yizhou, in 2030 under the generals Wei Wen and Zhu Ji. This expedition, while not particularly successful in its immediate objectives, most of the soldiers fell ill, and the expedition returned with only a modest number of indigenous captives, demonstrated a level of ocean-going capability that was significant. Building ships that could safely navigate the Taiwan Strait required knowledge of hull construction, waterproofing, navigation, and provisioning that went considerably beyond what was needed for river warfare. Meanwhile, on land, the engineering of fortifications was undergoing its own evolution. The Three Kingdoms period saw the construction and improvement of numerous defensive works, from city walls to border fortifications to the mountain fortresses that were characteristic of Shu defense of its Sichuan heartland. The geography of Shu was its greatest defensive asset. The Sichuan Basin is surrounded by mountains and accessible only through a limited number of passes and river gorges, and the defenders of Shu exploited this geography with a system of fortified positions that made invasion extraordinarily difficult. The fortification of Jianzhi, the Sword Gate Pass, is the most famous example. This narrow mountain pass was fortified with walls, towers, and obstacles that turned a natural choke point into a nearly impregnable defensive position. The engineering involved was not merely a matter of piling stones across a path. It required the construction of walls on steep terrain, the creation of defensive platforms that allowed defenders to fire down on attackers from multiple angles, and the development of supply and communication systems that could sustain a garrison in a remote mountain location. Wei, facing different geographical challenges, invested heavily in the fortification of its long northern and western borders. The threat from nomadic peoples, particularly the Xianbai, and the remnants of the Xiongnu required a network of border defenses that included walls, watchtowers, garrisoned forts, and a communication system capable of transmitting warnings across hundreds of miles. This was not the continuous Great Wall of later Chinese imagination, but rather a system of interlocking defensive positions linked by patrol routes and signal stations. The engineering was practical and iterative. Walls were built, tested by enemy attacks, repaired, and improved based on experience. The fortification techniques of the period included the use of rammed earth construction, a technology that had been in use in China for millennia, but that continued to be refined. Rammed earth walls were constructed by compacting layers of soil within temporary wooden frames, producing walls of surprising strength and durability. The Three Kingdoms period saw improvements in the composition of the earth mixture, with the addition of materials like lime and rice straw to increase strength and resistance to weathering. Some fortifications also incorporated brick and stone, though these materials were more commonly used for gates, towers, and other critical structural elements rather than for entire wall circuits. Siege warfare drove its own set of engineering innovations. The attackers and defenders of the period employed a variety of mechanical devices, including catapults, battering rams, siege towers, and tunneling equipment. The catapults of the Three Kingdoms period were primarily traction trebuchets devices that used teams of men pulling on ropes to launch projectiles, rather than the counterweight trebuchets that would appear later. These devices were not new to the period, but their tactical employment became more sophisticated as the Three Kingdoms settled into prolonged sieges of each other's fortified cities. Zhuge Liang, the Chancellor of Shu, is traditionally credited with numerous engineering innovations, and while many of these attributions are likely exaggerated or apocryphal, the historical core suggests a genuine emphasis on military engineering within the Shu state. The repeating crossbow, the Zhuge Liang, which literally bears his name, is perhaps the most famous of these attributed inventions. Though the basic mechanism of a repeating crossbow predated Zhuge Liang by centuries, what he may have done was improve the design, making it more reliable, easier to manufacture, or more effective in certain tactical situations. This is the kind of incremental engineering improvement that actually drives technological progress, not the creation of something entirely new, but the refinement of something existing, to the point where it becomes practically useful, but is also the kind of improvement that gets inflated in legend into the creation of a miraculous new weapon. The wooden ox and flowing horse Mu Liu may attributed to Zhuge Liang present a different kind of historical puzzle. The Sanguoji states plainly that Zhuge Liang invented these devices and used them to transport supplies through the difficult mountain terrain of the road between Shu's heartland and the Wei border. What these devices actually were has been debated for centuries. Proposals range from specialized wheelbarrows to complex mechanical automata, and the truth is that we simply do not know. The most prosaic and probably most accurate interpretation is that they were some form of improved wheelbarrow or hand cart designed for mountain paths, a device that would have been genuinely useful for supplying armies through terrain where conventional carts pulled by actual oxen could not operate. This interpretation lacks the romance of self-propelling mechanical animals, but it has the advantage of being plausible. The competition between the three states drove innovation in ways that a unified empire might not have. When you have three rival states, each trying to gain an advantage over the others, Each with somewhat different geographical challenges and resource bases, you create conditions that reward practical innovation. Wei, with its large population and agricultural heartland, invested in irrigation, land reclamation, and the administrative systems needed to extract maximum military potential from its demographic advantage. Shu, with its difficult terrain and smaller population, invested in defensive engineering and logistical innovations that could offset its numerical disadvantage. Wu, with its riverine and maritime geography, invested in shipbuilding and naval technology. Each state's innovations were shaped by its specific needs, and the result was a period of diversified technological development that might not have occurred under a single unified government pursuing a single strategic vision. This competitive dynamic also applied to fortification design. When one state developed a new offensive technique, the others were forced to develop countermeasures. When one state built a new type of defensive work, the others had to develop methods to overcome it. This action-reaction cycle drove continuous refinement in military engineering, even when no single innovation represented a dramatic breakthrough. The mundane reality of Three Kingdoms engineering is that most of it was about solving practical problems under conditions of scarcity and urgency. How do you feed an army of 100,000 men when your supply lines run through mountain passes that are impassable for half the year? How do you defend a river crossing when the enemy has more ships than you do? How do you keep your soldiers alive when epidemic disease is sweeping through the camp? These are not exciting questions, but they are the questions that actually determined who won and who lost. In the next part, we will examine the agricultural innovations of the period in greater detail, particularly the development of new irrigation systems and farming techniques that allowed the three states to sustain their military efforts over decades of continuous warfare. We will also explore the metallurgical advances that made better weapons and tools possible, and the textile production methods that kept armies clothed and economies functioning. The boring story deepens, and the deeper it goes, the more clearly we can see the real foundations of one of history's most romanticized eras. The boring story of China, the Three Kingdoms technology and discoveries, Part 3 Dirt, Water, and the slow work of staying alive. We left off with the promise that we would talk about agriculture, metallurgy, and textiles. These are not subjects that inspire epic poems. Nobody writes a ballad about a better plow. Nobody stages an opera about irrigation scheduling. But these are the subjects that determined whether millions of people lived or died during the Three Kingdoms period. And so these are the subjects we are going to discuss, in as much plodding detail as we can manage. Let us begin with the most fundamental problem facing all three kingdoms: food. War is hungry work. A single soldier in the field needs roughly 2 liters of grain per day to remain functional. When you multiply that by armies numbering in the tens of thousands, sometimes the hundreds of thousands, the logistical demands become staggering, and these soldiers are not growing food while they are marching and fighting. They have been taken away from their farms, which means that their fields are either lying fallow or being worked by whoever remains behind. Usually the elderly, women, and children, none of whom can produce at the same rate as a healthy adult male in his physical prime. Every soldier recruited represents a double cost: a mouth to feed and a pair of hands no longer feeding others. This was the central economic tension of the Three Kingdoms period, and every state dealt with it in roughly the same way, through a system called military agricultural colonies, or tunshan. The concept was not entirely new. It had precedents in the Qin and Han dynasties, but the Three Kingdoms states, particularly Wei under Cao Cao's administration, systematized and expanded the practice to a degree that had not been seen before. The basic idea was simple. Soldiers, when not actively campaigning, would farm. Civilian refugees, of whom there were enormous numbers due to the decades of warfare that had shattered the late Han, would be settled on state-owned land and required to farm it in exchange for protection and a share of the harvest. The state provided the tools, the seed grain, and the draft animals. The farmers provided the labor. The harvest was split, usually with the state taking between 50 and 60%, sometimes more, depending on whether the state had provided the oxen and equipment or whether the farmers had brought their own. This sounds exploitative, and in many ways it was. The farmers on these colonies had limited freedom. They were tied to the land in ways that prefigured later serfdom, like arrangements in Chinese history. They could not simply leave if they found the terms unfavorable. But from the perspective of state survival, the system worked remarkably well. It converted unproductive refugees into agricultural laborers, brought abandoned land back into cultivation, and produced the grain surpluses necessary to sustain military operations. Cao Cao established his first major agricultural colonies in the Exu province region around 196 CE, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Within a few years, state granaries that had been empty were full. The chronicles record that grain was abundant and that the army's supply problems, which had been chronic and severe, were substantially alleviated. This was not a glamorous achievement. It did not involve brilliant tactical maneuvers or heroic last stands. It involved bureaucrats allocating land, distributing seed, tracking harvests, and managing granary inventories. It involved oxen and plows and irrigation ditches and the endless, tedious cycle of planting and weeding and harvesting. But this boring administrative work gave Cao Cao a decisive strategic advantage. An army that can eat regularly is an army that can campaign for extended periods. An army that cannot eat regularly falls apart, regardless of how brilliant its commander might be. Many of Cao Cao's rivals in the early period of the wars failed precisely because they could not solve this basic logistical problem. They could win battles, but could not feed their soldiers between battles, and so their forces melted away through desertion and starvation. The agricultural colony system spread to all three kingdoms eventually. Wu established colonies in the Yangtze River Valley and in the newly developing regions of the south. Shu had implemented similar programs in the Sichuan Basin and along the routes leading to the northern frontier. Each state adapted the basic model to its own geographic and demographic circumstances, but the underlying principle was the same. Organize labor, cultivate land, produce grain, fill granaries, feed armies. Now let us talk about how that land was actually cultivated, because the Three Kingdoms period saw meaningful advances in agricultural technology that often go unrecognized. The most important agricultural tool in northern China during this period was the heavy plow. Chinese plow design had been evolving for centuries, and by the late Han and Three Kingdoms era, the standard plow in the north was a substantial iron-tipped implement capable of turning the heavy lowest soils of the Yellow River Basin. But the plows were not all identical, and there was ongoing refinement of plow design during this period aimed at making the implements more efficient. One area of development was in the design of the plowshare and moldboard. A good moldboard does not merely cut the soil. It turns it over, burying surface weeds and crop residue while bringing fresh soil to the surface. The effectiveness of the moldboard depends on its shape, its angle relative to the direction of travel, and its surface smoothness. Small improvements in moldboard geometry could make a meaningful difference in how much land a single farmer with a single ox could plow in a day. These improvements happened incrementally, through the accumulated experience of thousands of farmers and blacksmiths making small adjustments over time. Nobody recorded the name of the blacksmith who first figured out that a slightly more curved moldboard turned the soil more cleanly. But that anonymous improvement, multiplied across thousands of plows and millions of acres, had a greater impact on the course of the Three Kingdoms than most of the famous battles. Irrigation was another area of critical importance. Northern China relies on irrigation for consistent agricultural production. Rainfall is seasonal and unreliable, and the difference between a good harvest and a famine can depend on whether water is available at the right time during the growing season. The Three Kingdom states invested heavily in irrigation infrastructure, not because they had a particular love of engineering, but because their survival depended on it. In the Wei Kingdom, The most significant irrigation works were concentrated in the Guangdong region, the Wei River Valley in modern Shaanxi province, and in the areas around the capital at Luoyang. These projects involved the construction and maintenance of canals, reservoirs, and water distribution systems that channeled river water to agricultural fields. Some of these projects built on existing Han Dynasty infrastructure that had fallen into disrepair during the wars. Others were new constructions designed to bring previously uncultivated land into production. The engineering involved was not conceptually sophisticated by modern standards, but it was practically demanding. Building a canal requires surveying the terrain to establish proper gradients, excavating enormous volumes of earth, lining the canal bed to prevent excessive seepage, and constructing control structures like gates and weirs to regulate water flow. All of this had to be done with hand tools and human labor, organized and directed by officials who understood both the engineering principles and the management of large labor forces. One figure who deserves mention in this context, though he rarely appears in the romanticized accounts, is Liu Fu, who served as governor of Yang province under Cao Cao. Liu Fu is credited with organizing the construction of extensive irrigation works that brought large areas of previously marginal land into productive cultivation. He settled refugees on this newly irrigated land and established the agricultural colonies that helped feed Wei's eastern armies. His work was administrative and technical. He did not fight dramatic battles or engage in clever stratagems. He built canals and settled farmers and managed grain supplies, and by doing so, he contributed more to Wei's ultimate success than many of the famous generals, whose exploits fill the pages of the romance of the Three Kingdoms. In the south, Wu faced different agricultural challenges. The Yangtze River Valley and the regions further south had abundant water, but much of the land was covered in dense vegetation, swampy or otherwise difficult to cultivate using the techniques developed for the drier north. The expansion of agriculture in the south during the Three Kingdoms period required land clearance on a massive scale, the development of drainage systems to make swampy land usable, and the adaptation of farming techniques to the wet rice cultivation that was more appropriate for the southern climate. Wet rice cultivation is a fundamentally different agricultural system from the dry grain farming practiced in the north. It requires the construction and maintenance of paddy fields, which are essentially artificial ponds in which rice is grown in standing water. Building a paddy field requires leveling the ground to a precise grade, constructing low earthen dikes to retain water, and establishing channels to flood and drain the paddies at the appropriate times during the growing cycle. It is extraordinarily labor-intensive to establish but highly productive once in operation, yielding significantly more calories per acre than dry grain farming. The expansion of wet rice cultivation in the south during the Three Kingdoms period was one of the most consequential developments in Chinese agricultural history, though its full impact would not be felt for several more centuries. Wu's investments in southern agricultural development laid the groundwork for the eventual economic shift that would make the Yangtze River Valley the primary economic engine of China, surpassing the north. But during the Three Kingdoms period itself, this process was still in its early stages. The south was still being developed, still being cleared and drained and terraced. It was slow, grinding work that produced results over decades, not months. Shuhan, occupying the Sichuan Basin, had its own particular agricultural advantages and challenges. The Sichuan Basin is one of the most naturally fertile regions in China, blessed with rich soil, adequate rainfall, and a mild climate that allows for extended growing seasons. The Dujianjin irrigation system, originally constructed in the 3rd century BC by Li Bing, continued to function during the Three Kingdoms period and provided reliable water distribution across the Chengdu Plain. Shuan's agricultural problem was therefore less about productivity per acre and more about the limited total area of cultivable land available. The Sichuan Basin is surrounded by mountains, and while the land within the basin is excellent, there is only so much of it. This fundamental geographic limitation placed a ceiling on Shuan's total agricultural production and, consequently, on the size of the population and military forces it could sustain. This is one of the key reasons why Shuhan was ultimately the weakest of the three kingdoms. Not because its leaders were less competent or its soldiers less brave, but because it simply did not have enough farmland to compete with the larger states on equal terms. Zhuge Liang, who is remembered primarily as a brilliant strategist, devoted enormous attention to agricultural administration in Shuhan. He understood, perhaps better than any other leader of the period, that military campaigns could not be sustained without a solid agricultural foundation. His management of Shuhan's economy was careful and conservative, aimed at maximizing production from the limited land available. He promoted the use of improved farming techniques, invested in maintaining and extending irrigation systems, and implemented policies designed to ensure that agricultural labor was not unnecessarily diverted to other purposes. When he launched his northern expeditions against Wei, one of his persistent problems was supply. The mountainous terrain between Sichuan and the Wei River Valley made it extremely difficult to transport sufficient grain to support a large army on campaign. This logistical constraint, more than any battlefield defeat, was the primary reason his northern expeditions repeatedly failed to achieve their objectives. The mountains did not care about his brilliance. They simply made it physically impossible to move enough grain from where it was produced to where it was needed. Now let us turn to metallurgy, because the Three Kingdoms period saw important developments in iron and steel production that had both military and civilian applications. China had been producing cast iron since the 5th century BC, far earlier than any other civilization. By the Han Dynasty, the Chinese iron industry was large, sophisticated, and state-controlled. The state monopoly on iron production, established during the reign of Emperor Wu in the 2nd century BC, had created a centralized production system with large-scale foundries producing standardized tools and weapons. The collapse of the Han Dynasty disrupted this system, but the three successor states each worked to rebuild and maintain iron production capacity within their territories. The key metallurgical development of this period was the continued refinement of steel production techniques. Steel, which is iron with a carefully controlled carbon content, is harder and more durable than either pure iron or high-carbon cast iron. Chinese metallurgists had been experimenting with steel production for centuries, and by the Three Kingdoms period, several methods were in use. One was the co-fusion method, in which cast iron and wrought iron were melted together to produce steel with an intermediate carbon content. This technique, which would later be documented in detail during the Song dynasty, was already being practiced during the Three Kingdoms era, though the documentation from this period is sparse. Another technique was the repeated forging and folding of iron to produce a laminated structure that combined the hardness of high-carbon steel with the toughness of lower-carbon iron. This was the technique used to produce the best swords and other edged weapons. A well-made sword from this period would have been folded dozens of times, producing a blade with hundreds or thousands of layers of alternating steel composition. The result was a weapon that could take and hold a sharp edge while being resistant to breaking under impact. The famous swords attributed to various Three Kingdoms heroes in the romance, weapons with romantic names and supposed magical properties, were in reality the products of this painstaking metallurgical process. There was nothing magical about them. They were the result of skilled blacksmiths spending hours at the forge, heating and hammering and folding and quenching, applying techniques refined over generations of accumulated craft knowledge. The best swordsmiths of the period were producing weapons that were genuinely superior in metallurgical quality to those available to their predecessors. But this improvement was the result of incremental technical refinement, not divine intervention or heroic genius. Beyond weapons, iron and steel were essential for agricultural tools. Good plowshares, hoes, sickles, and other implements made farming more efficient and helped the agricultural colonies produce the surpluses that the states required. The quality of a kingdom's iron production had direct implications for its agricultural productivity, which in turn affected its military capacity. This chain of causation, from foundry to forge to farm to field to army to battlefield, is the kind of connection that the Romantic narratives ignore entirely, but that was absolutely fundamental to how the Three Kingdoms period actually worked. Finally, let us address textile production, a subject of almost heroic boredom, but genuine historical importance. Armies need clothing. Soldiers need uniforms, padded armor, tents, banners, bandages, rope, and sacks for carrying grain. Civilian populations need clothing for everyday wear. The production of all these items required a functioning textile industry. In the North, the primary textile fiber was hemp, supplemented by silk for luxury goods and official use. In the South, rami, a plant fiber similar to hemp, was also widely used. Cotton, which would later become China's dominant textile fiber, was not yet widely cultivated in the core Chinese territories during the Three Kingdoms period. It was known as an exotic import from the western regions and southern frontiers, but had not yet become a major crop. Silk production was particularly important in Shuhan. The Sichuan Basin had been a major silk-producing region since ancient times, and silk was one of Shuhan's most valuable export commodities. Zhuge Liang actively promoted sericulture, the raising of silkworms, as a way to generate revenue for the state. Shuhan silk was traded to Wei and Wu, and beyond, generating income that helped compensate for the kingdom's limited agricultural base. Silk was, in effect, a cash crop that allowed Shuhan to purchase what it could not produce domestically. The textile production process was labor-intensive at every stage. Fibers had to be harvested, cleaned, and processed before spinning. Spinning converted raw fiber into thread, a time-consuming task usually performed by women using hand spindles or simple spinning wheels. The spun thread then had to be woven into cloth on looms, another labor-intensive process. Finally, the finished cloth had to be cut and sewn into garments or other items. Every step required skill, time, and labor. None of this is exciting, none of it makes for good storytelling. But without textiles, armies march naked, grain cannot be transported, wounds cannot be bandaged, and the entire machinery of warfare grinds to a halt. The women spinning thread in their homes were as essential to the war effort as the soldiers wielding swords on the battlefield. Though they receive no mention in the chronicles and no recognition in the popular narratives, this is the persistent pattern of the boring story. The things that mattered most are the things that receive the least attention. The foundations are invisible because they are buried beneath the drama that they support. But without those foundations, the drama could not exist. In the next part, we will examine medical knowledge and epidemic disease during the Three Kingdoms period, the development of cartography and geographic knowledge, and the administrative systems that held the three states together. We will meet a few more people who did important things that nobody remembers, and we will continue to insist that the real history is found not in the moments of glory, but in the long, quiet stretches of ordinary work that made everything else possible. There is a particular kind of terror that does not appear in heroic narratives. It is not the terror of facing an enemy across a battlefield, or the terror of a siege, or even the terror of betrayal in a palace corridor. It is the terror of watching your child develop a fever and knowing that nothing you can do will make the fever stop. It is the terror of watching a rash spread across your own body and understanding, with a clarity that leaves no room for hope, what that rash means. It is the terror of epidemic disease, and during the period of the Three Kingdoms it killed more people than all the battles and sieges and betrayals combined. This is not a matter of speculation. The population figures, fragmentary and unreliable as all ancient population figures are, tell a story so stark that even their unreliability cannot obscure it. The census of 157 C, conducted during the late Eastern Han, recorded approximately 56 million people. By the time the Jin dynasty reunified China in 280 C, The registered population had fallen to approximately 16 million, even accounting for the massive disruptions to census taking. Even acknowledging that millions of people had fled to remote areas where no census taker could find them. Even granting every possible qualification, the demographic collapse of the late Han and Three Kingdoms period was catastrophic. War was one cause, famine was another, but epidemic disease was almost certainly the largest killer of all. The epidemics began before the formal end of the Han dynasty. A devastating plague struck in 171 C. Another followed in 73, another in 79, another in 82, another in 85. The frequency is notable. These were not isolated events, but a recurring pattern of mass mortality that destabilized the empire and contributed directly to the social upheaval from which the Yellow Turban Rebellion emerged. The Yellow Turbans, after all, began as a healing movement. Zhang Zhu, their founder, attracted followers not primarily through political ideology, but through the promise that he could cure disease. This tells us something important about the conditions in which ordinary people were living. When a religious movement based on faith, healing can attract hundreds of thousands of followers. The underlying reality is one of medical desperation on a scale that is difficult to imagine from the comfortable distance of the present. The epidemics continued through the wars that ended the Han and established the Three Kingdoms. Cao Cao's army was devastated by disease during the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 C. This is one of the rare cases where epidemic disease actually enters the popular narrative, because it provides a partial explanation for Cao Cao's defeat, and Cao Cao's defeat is one of the pivotal moments in the story. But even here, the disease functions mainly as a plot device. It explains why Cao Cao lost. It does not receive attention as a phenomenon in its own right as a mass mortality event that killed tens of thousands of soldiers and uncounted civilians in the surrounding areas, that left bodies rotting in the winter camps and along the Yangtze River banks. That continued to kill long after the battle was over and the storytellers had moved on to the next dramatic episode. The nature of these epidemics remains debated. Various scholars have proposed smallpox, typhoid, measles, and other candidates. The descriptions in contemporary sources are not specific enough for confident retrospective diagnosis. What we can say is that the diseases struck repeatedly, that they killed enormous numbers of people, and that they fundamentally shaped the political and military landscape of the Three Kingdoms period. Every strategic calculation, every campaign plan, every administrative decision was made in the shadow of epidemic disease. The population available for conscription was smaller than it should have been. The agricultural labor force was depleted. Whole regions were depopulated. The three states of Wei, Shu, and Wu governed territories that had been hollowed out by disease. And much of what they did, much of the boring, unglamorous administrative work that constituted the actual business of governing, was an attempt to manage the consequences of that hollowing. Into this context of recurring epidemic disease, we can place the figure of Zhang Zhongjing, who lived during the late Han and into the early Three Kingdoms period, and who wrote one of the foundational texts of Chinese medicine. His work, the Shengen Zabing Lun, which is usually translated as the Treatise on Cold Damage and Miscellaneous Diseases, was written in direct response to the epidemics. Zhang Zhongjing stated in his preface that 2/3 of his clan had died from epidemic disease over a period of less than 10 years, and that this experience motivated him to study medicine systematically. He was, in the most literal sense, writing out of grief. The Shengen Zabing Lun is not exciting reading. It is a systematic classification of disease conditions organized by a theoretical framework involving 6 stages of illness progression. It prescribes specific herbal formulas for specific combinations of symptoms. It is methodical, detailed, and above all practical. Zhang Zhongjing was not interested in grand theories for their own sake. He was interested in what worked. His formulas were based on careful observation of what happened when you gave particular combinations of herbs to people with particular symptoms. Some of these formulas are still used in traditional Chinese medicine today. which is a remarkable continuity spanning nearly 2,000 years. But Zhang Zhongjing is not a character in the romance of the Three Kingdoms. He does not appear in the operas or the video games. The person who does appear in the popular narratives as the representative of medicine during this period is Hua Tu, a physician who is famous for dramatic anecdotes performing surgery on Guan Yu's arm while Guan Yu calmly played chess, proposing to open Cao Cao's skull to treat his headaches and being executed for his trouble. These stories are vivid, memorable, and largely fictional. They serve the narrative purposes of the romance. They tell us nothing useful about the actual state of medical knowledge or the real experience of disease during the Three Kingdoms period. Zhang Zhongjing, by contrast, left behind a text that actually tells us something. But texts are boring. Systematic classification is boring. Herbal formulas organized by symptom presentation are boring. A man calmly playing chess while a surgeon cuts into his arm is not boring at all. And so that is the story that survives in popular memory, while the careful, grief-driven work of actually trying to understand and treat disease is forgotten. This pattern extends to every domain of knowledge during the Three Kingdoms period. The things that were most important were also the least dramatic, and the least dramatic things are the things that fall out of the stories. Consider cartography. Maps are fundamental to governance. You cannot administer a territory you cannot describe. You cannot plan a military campaign without understanding the terrain. You cannot collect taxes without knowing what land exists and who occupies it. Maps are so basic to the functioning of a state that their existence tends to be taken for granted, and the work of creating them tends to be invisible. During the Three Kingdoms period, Pei Xiu, who served in the state of Wei and later under the Jin dynasty, developed a set of 6 principles for accurate map making. These principles addressed scale, orientation, distance measurement, elevation, and the relationship between straight line and actual traveled distances over varied terrain. They represented a systematic approach to the problem of translating 3-dimensional landscape onto a 2-dimensional surface. Pei Xiu's principles were used in Chinese cartography for centuries afterward. He is sometimes called the father of Chinese cartography, though like most father of designations, this is an oversimplification that obscures the work of many unnamed predecessors. The important thing about Pei Xiu's work is not that it was brilliant, though it was competent and systematic. The important thing is that it was necessary. The 3 states needed accurate maps. They needed to know the locations of rivers and mountains and roads and cities. They needed to know distances. They needed this information to move armies, collect taxes, allocate resources, and make decisions. Someone had to do the painstaking work of surveying terrain, recording measurements, and producing documents that administrators could use. Pei Xiu formalized the principles that guided this work. But the work itself was done by hundreds or thousands of unnamed surveyors and scribes who walked the roads, measured the distances, and drew the maps that made governance possible. None of this is in the romance. There is no dramatic scene in which a cartographer carefully measures the distance between 2 cities and records the result. There is no moment of tension in which a surveyor adjusts his calculations to account for the curvature of a hillside. These activities are invisible in the narrative because they are inherently undramatic. And yet they were more important to the actual functioning of the Three Kingdoms than most of the battles and duels and stratagems that fill the popular accounts. The same is true of administrative systems more broadly. The 3 states of Wei, Shu, and Wu were functioning governments. They collected taxes, they maintained armies, they built and repaired infrastructure, they administered justice. After a fashion, they conducted censuses, maintained registers, appointed officials, and communicated orders across large territories. All of this required systems, bureaucratic procedures, record-keeping practices, chains of command, mechanisms for accountability, and all the other mundane components of governance. The state of Wei, under Cao Cao and his successors, implemented the 9-rank system for selecting officials. This was a method of evaluating and ranking potential government servants based on assessments by local evaluators. The system was floated tended to favor established elite families and gradually became a mechanism for aristocratic consolidation rather than meritocratic selection. But it was a system. It was an attempt to solve the real and difficult problem of identifying competent people to fill government positions across a large territory. It replaced the earlier recommendation system that had become hopelessly corrupt during the late Han. It would itself be replaced, eventually, by the examination system that became the hallmark of later Chinese governance. But for the Three Kingdoms period and several centuries afterward, the nine-rank system was how officials were selected, and its implementation shaped the character of governance in ways that were far more significant than any individual battle or political intrigue. The state of Shu under Zhuge Liang's direction implemented administrative reforms that were notable for their emphasis on strict legalism and even-handed enforcement. Zhuge Liang is remembered in the popular narratives as a military genius and a master strategist. His actual legacy, the thing he actually spent most of his time doing, was administration. He managed the economy of a relatively small and resource-poor state. He organized agricultural production. He maintained a tax system that was efficient enough to support military campaigns, but not so oppressive that it provoked rebellion. He enforced laws consistently, punishing allies and favorites as readily as enemies. This made him effective and it made him respected. But it is not the stuff of drama. A man sitting at a desk reviewing tax records and making personnel decisions is not a compelling image, even if that man is also capable of the strategic brilliance attributed to Zhuge Liang in the romance. The desk and the tax records are the boring part, and the boring part is what actually mattered. The state of Wu developed administrative systems adapted to its particular geographic circumstances. The Yangtze River Delta and the southern territories that Wu controlled were less developed than the northern heartland. Wu's administration had to manage the integration of indigenous populations, the development of new agricultural land, and the expansion of maritime and riverine trade. Wu invested in naval capabilities not primarily for the dramatic purpose of fighting battles on the Yantids, though such battles did occur, but for the mundane purpose of maintaining communication and trade routes across a territory that was defined by its waterways. The ships that carried grain and administrative communications up and down the rivers were more important than the warships. But they are not the ships that appear in the stories. Wu also conducted maritime expeditions, including a notable voyage to the island of Taiwan around 230 C. This expedition is sometimes cited as evidence of Wu's naval ambitions, but its practical results were modest. The expedition party brought back several thousand indigenous people, essentially a slave raid dressed up as exploration, and the costs of the expedition were generally considered to have exceeded any benefits. The point is not that the expedition was impressive, but that it occurred at all. It indicates a level of naval capability and geographic knowledge that is easily overlooked when the focus is on land-based military campaigns. All three states invested in irrigation and agricultural development because all three states understood that their survival depended on food production. Wei continued to develop the agricultural colonies, the Tunshan system, that Cao Cao had established. Shu maintained and expanded the ancient Dujianjian irrigation system in the Chengdu Plain. Wu developed new rice paddies in the south. These projects were not glamorous. They involved digging channels, building dikes, clearing land, and organizing labor. They produced rice and wheat, not glory. But they kept people alive. And keeping people alive was the fundamental challenge of governance in a period when epidemic disease, war, and displacement had reduced the population by more than half. There is a particular kind of heroism in this work that does not look like heroism at all. It is the heroism of the local official who ensures that the irrigation channels are maintained, that the grain tax is collected fairly, that disputes are resolved before they become violent, that the census is updated, that the roads are passable. This official does not have a name in the historical record. He is one of thousands of men who held minor posts in the administrations of Wei, Shu, and Wu, and who did the daily work of keeping the state functioning. He woke up each morning and did his job. He solved small problems. He kept records. He made decisions that affected the lives of the people in his district. And most of those decisions were competent and unremarkable. He was not a hero. He was a bureaucrat. But without him, the heroes could not have functioned. Without him, there would have been no armies to lead, no campaigns to plan, no kingdoms to fight over. The boring story of the three kingdoms is his story. It is the story of the physician who studied Zhang Zhongjing's text and tried to treat patients during an epidemic, knowing that most of them would die regardless. It is the story of the surveyor who measured the distance between two towns and drew a line on a map. It is the story of the tax collector, the census taker, the irrigation engineer, the granary manager, the minor official who spent his entire career in a single district and whose name appears in no history. These are the people who constituted the actual substance of the three kingdoms. The generals and emperors and strategists were the visible surface. The bureaucrats and technicians and farmers were the mass beneath that surface, the mass that gave the surface its shape and its weight. We have one more part to go in this account. In it, we will look at what happened when the three kingdoms ended, not the dramatic moments of conquest and surrender, but the quiet transition from one set of administrative arrangements to another, and what was preserved and what was lost. We will consider the legacy of this period in terms of the things that actually lasted, as opposed to the things that were merely remembered, and we will try to draw some conclusions about why the boring parts of history matter, and why we are so persistently drawn to the exciting parts instead, and what we might learn if we could train ourselves to pay attention to the things that do not make for good stories. The Three Kingdoms period ended as most periods do, not with a single dramatic event but with a sequence of administrative adjustments took years to complete, and that most people living through them experienced as a change in which officials collected their taxes and which seals appeared on their documents. The conventional date is 280 C, when the state of Wu surrendered to the Jin dynasty, which had already absorbed Wei through a transfer of power that was itself a remarkably bureaucratic affair. Sima Yan, who became the first emperor of Jin, had followed the same path that the Cao family had followed generations earlier, accumulating offices, receiving honors, and then accepting the abdication of the last Wei emperor in a ceremony that was designed to look voluntary, and that followed precedents everyone understood. The Wu surrender was more conventionally military, involving the movement of armies and the capitulation of a court, but even this was less catastrophic than one might expect. The Wu bureaucracy was largely retained. Local administrators continued to administer. The granaries that had been Wu granaries became Jin granaries. The irrigation systems that had been maintained by Wu engineers continued to be maintained by the same engineers, or their successors, who now reported to different superiors. This is worth pausing over, because it tells us something important about the nature of the Three Kingdoms period and about the nature of the things we have been discussing throughout this account. The technologies and discoveries and administrative systems that characterized the three states did not, for the most part, end when the states ended. They were absorbed, continued, modified, and transmitted forward. The things that ended were the courts, the rivalries, the particular configurations of loyalty and ambition that had defined the political landscape for the better part of a century. The things that continued were the things that had been boring all along. Consider what the Jin dynasty inherited. It inherited three separate but broadly compatible systems of civil administration, each of which had developed its own refinements over decades of independent operation. It inherited agricultural infrastructure, irrigation networks, land management systems, seed distribution practices that represented the accumulated knowledge of three generations of administrators working in different ecological conditions. It inherited metallurgical traditions that had been advancing steadily in all three states, producing better iron, better steel, and better techniques for working both. It inherited ceramic production methods that were, by 280, significantly more sophisticated than they had been in 220. It inherited medical texts that had been compiled, copied, and annotated in all three kingdoms, representing a body of practical knowledge about disease, treatment, and pharmacology that was genuinely substantial. It inherited cartographic methods, surveying techniques, and mathematical tools that had been developed to serve the practical needs of states engaged in war, taxation, and construction. It inherited shipbuilding knowledge from Wu that was among the most advanced in the world at that time. It inherited, in short, the boring parts, and the boring parts were what mattered. Let us take stock of these inheritances more carefully, because doing so will help us understand what the Three Kingdoms period actually accomplished, as opposed to what it is remembered for. In agriculture, the most significant legacy was probably the system of military agricultural colonies. The Tunshan, which Wei had developed most extensively, but which all three states had practiced in some form. These colonies represented a particular solution to a particular problem: how to feed an army and settle a population simultaneously, in conditions where labor was scarce and land was either underutilized or had been abandoned during the wars. The solution was not elegant. It involved detailed record-keeping, careful allocation of resources, supervision of planting and harvesting schedules, and constant adjustment to local conditions. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of thing that does not appear in literary accounts of the period. But it worked, and the principles behind it, the integration of military and agricultural labor, the systematic development of marginal land, the use of state resources to support initial settlement with the expectation of future tax revenue, continued to influence Chinese statecraft for centuries. The specific improvements in rice cultivation that had occurred in Wu territory were similarly durable. The development of better paddy management techniques, the selection of rice varieties suited to particular conditions, the construction and maintenance of water control systems, all of this continued under the Jin and was further developed by subsequent dynasties. The Yangtze River Valley's transformation into one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world was a process that began before the Three Kingdoms and continued long after, but the decades of Wu administration contributed materially to that process. Wu officials who oversaw land reclamation and irrigation projects were doing work whose effects would outlast their state by centuries. In metallurgy, the advances of the Three Kingdoms period are difficult to isolate precisely because they were part of a longer continuum. Chinese iron and steel production had been advancing for centuries before the Three Kingdoms, and it continued to advance for centuries after. But the evidence suggests that the demands of prolonged warfare accelerated certain developments. The need for large quantities of weapons and armor of consistent quality drove improvements in smelting techniques, in the control of carbon content in steel, and in the organization of production. Archaeological evidence from Three Kingdoms era sites shows iron and steel objects of notably high quality, and the techniques used to produce them, including various methods of combining high-carbon and low-carbon iron to produce steel with desirable properties, were transmitted forward to subsequent periods. What is interesting about these metallurgical advances is how completely they are ignored in the literary tradition. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the great novel that shaped popular understanding of the period, is full of named weapons: the green dragon crescent blade, the paired swords of Liu Bei, the serpent spear of Zhang Fei, but it has nothing to say about the processes by which weapons were actually made, or about the anonymous smiths who made them, or about the incremental improvements in technique that made later weapons better than earlier ones. The named weapons are interesting because they are attached to named heroes. The unnamed weapons, the thousands of spearheads and arrowheads and sword blades that were produced in state workshops by workers whose names were never recorded, are not interesting in the same way. but they represent the actual metallurgical achievement of the period. In ceramics, the Three Kingdoms period saw developments that were genuinely important in the longer history of Chinese material culture. The proto-Celadon wares produced in Wu territory, particularly in the kilns of what is now Zhejiang province, represented a significant step in the evolution of Chinese ceramic technology. These were not yet the refined Celadons of later centuries, but they showed an increasing mastery of glaze chemistry, kiln temperature control, and forming techniques. The potters working in these kilns were solving technical problems: how to achieve a consistent glaze color, how to control the atmosphere inside a kiln, how to prevent warping and cracking during firing that would continue to occupy Chinese ceramicists for generations. Their solutions were empirical rather than theoretical. They did not understand the chemistry of what they were doing in terms that a modern scientist would recognize, but they understood it in practical terms, and their practical understanding was transmitted through apprenticeship and practice to the potters who came after them. In medicine, the legacy of the Three Kingdoms period centers on texts and practices rather than on institutions. The works attributed to Zhang Zhongjing and Hoa Tu, whatever their actual provenance, were copied and transmitted and became part of the canon of Chinese medical literature. More importantly, the practical traditions they represented: the systematic observation of symptoms, the classification of diseases, the testing and recording of herbal remedies continued as ongoing activities. Medicine in this period was not a profession in the modern sense. It was a body of knowledge held by various practitioners, some of whom were officials, some of whom were itinerant healers, some of whom were monks or scholars who had an interest in the subject. The knowledge moved between these practitioners through texts, through personal instruction, and through practice, and the Three Kingdoms period was one segment of a much longer transmission. The pharmacological knowledge accumulated during this period was particularly significant. The expansion of the Chinese herbal pharmacopoeia was a continuous process, driven by the exploration of new territories, contact with different ecological zones, and the steady accumulation of empirical observations about which plants had which effects. The movement of populations during the Three Kingdoms period: soldiers marching through unfamiliar landscapes, refugees settling in new regions, administrators posted to distant provinces facilitated this accumulation by bringing people into contact with plants and remedies they had not previously known. This was not a deliberate program of pharmaceutical research. It was a byproduct of displacement and movement, a boring consequence of dramatic events. In mathematics and astronomy, the Three Kingdoms period produced work that was genuinely original, though its significance is easy to overlook because it took the form of incremental refinement rather than revolutionary breakthrough. The calculation of pi to greater precision, the development of new methods for solving systems of equations, the improvement of astronomical observations and calendar calculations, these were contributions to ongoing traditions of Chinese mathematical and astronomical work. They did not change the world overnight. They did not even change it over the course of a generation. But they moved the state of knowledge forward, and the knowledge they produced was used by subsequent generations to move it forward further. Liu Hui's commentary on the 9 chapters on the mathematical art, produced in the Wei Kingdom around 263 CE, is perhaps the best single example of what the Three Kingdoms period actually contributed to human knowledge. It is a meticulous, careful, intellectually rigorous work of mathematical analysis. It is not exciting. It does not tell a story. It does not involve heroes or villains or dramatic reversals of fortune. It involves a man sitting with a text and thinking carefully about what the text says, and whether it is correct and how it might be improved. This is exactly the kind of activity that history tends to forget, and exactly the kind of activity that actually advances human understanding. Liu Hui's work on the calculation of pi, using a method of successive polygon approximation, was technically brilliant. He inscribed polygons with increasingly large numbers of sides inside a circle and calculated their perimeters. approaching the circumference of the circle as a limit. He carried this process out to a 3072-sided polygon and obtained a value of pi accurate to 5 decimal places. This was, by the standards of the 3rd century, an extraordinary achievement. It was also an achievement that required patience, precision, and a tolerance for repetitive calculation that most people would find unbearable. It was, in the most literal sense, boring work. And it was among the most important things that anyone did during the Three Kingdoms period. What conclusions can we draw from all of this? Several, though none of them are dramatic. The first is that the Three Kingdoms period, like most periods of history, was primarily characterized not by its exceptional events but by its ordinary ones. The battles and betrayals and heroic last stands that fill the literary accounts were real, and they mattered. But they mattered less than the daily work of growing food, making things, maintaining infrastructure, recording knowledge, and solving practical problems. This daily work was done by people whose names were mostly not recorded, and it produced results that were mostly not celebrated, and those results were what actually constituted the legacy of the period. The second conclusion is that technology and knowledge advance primarily through accumulation rather than through invention. The Three Kingdoms period did not produce many inventions in the sense of things that were entirely new. What it produced were refinements, improvements, extensions, and applications of existing knowledge. Better iron, better ceramics, better rice cultivation, more accurate values of pi, more comprehensive lists of medicinal herbs. These are not the kinds of achievements that inspire stories, but they are the kinds of achievements that, accumulated over decades and centuries, transform the material conditions of human life. The third conclusion is that the transmission of knowledge is itself a form of achievement that we consistently undervalue. The fact that the medical texts of the late Han were copied and preserved during the Three Kingdoms period, that the mathematical traditions were maintained and extended, that agricultural techniques were recorded and transmitted, these acts of preservation and transmission were essential to the continuity of Chinese civilization, and they were performed by people who understood themselves to be doing important work, even if no one would ever write stories about them. The fourth conclusion, and perhaps the most important, is that we are drawn to exciting history for reasons that have very little to do with understanding the past and very much to do with the kinds of minds we have. We are storytelling animals. We remember narratives. We remember characters. We remember moments of crisis and resolution. We do not easily remember processes, trends, accumulations, and incremental changes. This is a feature of human cognition, not a flaw. But it does mean that our natural understanding of the past is systematically distorted. We remember the Three Kingdoms as a period of heroic warfare and political drama, because those are the things our minds are built to remember. We forget it as a period of agricultural development, metallurgical improvement, and mathematical refinement, because those are the things our minds are built to forget. This distortion has consequences. When we think about what makes a period of history significant, we tend to think in terms of the things we remember, the dramatic events, the famous individuals, the decisive moments, but significance, properly understood, is a question about effects. What happened during a period that made the future different from what it would otherwise have been? And when we ask that question about the Three Kingdoms period, the answer is mostly about boring things. The future was different because rice cultivation in the Yangtze Valley had been improved. The future was different because iron and steel production had been refined. The future was different because Liu Hui had calculated pi to 5 decimal places. The future was different because someone whose name we do not know had figured out a better way to manage a kiln, or drain a field, or treat a fever. The exciting parts of the Three Kingdoms, the battles, the stratagems, the oaths of brotherhood, the tragic defeats did not, for the most part, make the future different. They made the present vivid and the past memorable, which is not the same thing. Zhuge Liang's northern expeditions failed. The oath at the peach garden, if it happened at all, bound 3 men who all died without achieving their stated goal. The Battle of Red Cliffs determined which warlords would control which territories for the next few decades, which mattered a great deal to the people involved, but did not change the fundamental trajectory of Chinese civilization. What changed that trajectory to the modest extent that any single period can be said to change it? Were the boring things, the technologies improved, the knowledge accumulated, the systems maintained, the infrastructure built. These were the real discoveries of the 3 kingdoms, and they were made not by heroes but by workers, not in moments of crisis, but in the long, undramatic stretches of ordinary time that constituted the vast majority of the period. And that constitute the vast majority of all periods, and that we would do well to attend to more carefully than we do. This has been an account of boring things. It has not been an exciting read. That is, in some sense, the point. The most important things that happened during the 3 kingdoms period were not exciting, and any account that makes them exciting is, to that extent, an account that misrepresents them. The challenge for anyone who wants to understand the past, rather than merely to be entertained by it, is to find a way to take boring things seriously, to pay attention to them, to think about them, to recognize their significance without pretending that they are something other than what they are. They are boring. They are also what mattered. These 2 facts are not in conflict. They are, if anything, related.